What happens when a billionaire publicly humiliates his ex-wife at the most prestigious gala of the year? Richard Beaumont, a titan of industry, thought he had it all. Standing on a pedestal of wealth and arrogance, he pointed at his former wife, Catherine, and let out a booming laugh for all to hear, mocking her fall from grace. He thought she was a forgotten chapter, a nobody, but he made one critical mistake. He forgot who he was dealing with. In the next 60 seconds, the entire world would watch as the sound of rotor blades silenced the crowd, and all cameras turned towards the sky, capturing an arrival that would not just shatter Richard's ego, but threaten to bring his entire empire crumbling to the ground. The divorce wasn't a battle, it was a demolition. Richard Beaumont, with the full might of Beaumont Industries and the legal prowess of Sullivan and Cromwell Elp behind him, had systematically dismantled Catherine Davenport's life. In the sterile mahogany-paneled conference room high above Park Avenue, she hadn't stood a chance. Richard's lead counsel, a shark named Arthur Kendrick, had laid out the terms with a chillingly polite smile. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad, he'd explained, as if speaking to a child. Catherine would receive a one-time settlement, a sum that sounded vast to the average person, but was in Richard's world less than the depreciation on his private jet in a single year. She would forfeit any claim to their properties, their art collection, and most cruelly, any stake in the company she had quietly helped shape. "You were a decorator," Catherine Richard had said, his voice laced with a casual cruelty that was far more painful than outright rage. He adjusted his Brioni tie, a picture of unassailable power. "You picked out curtains and planned parties. Let's not pretend you were ever a partner in any meaningful sense." Catherine remembered gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. She had wanted to scream. She had wanted to list every late night she'd spent combing through financial reports. He'd been too bored to read every strategic insight she'd offered over dinner that he'd later presented as his own in the boardroom. Every social event she had masterfully orchestrated to woo a difficult investor or smooth over one of his public gaffes. She had been his silent strategist, his social architect, his emotional ballast. He had seen her as furniture. The final decree felt like a final nail. The press, fed a steady diet of curated leaks from Richard's PR team, painted a predictable picture. The beautiful but vapid socialite attempting to fleece her brilliant, long-suffering husband. The headlines in the New York Post were brutal. Catherine stopped leaving her apartment, the palatial Fifth Avenue penthouse that was no longer hers. The silence in the vast space was deafening, broken only by the hum of the climate control and the distant symphony of city traffic. Her last day in the penthouse was a study in humiliation. Richard had sent his new girlfriend, a lingerie model named Lauren, to supervise Catherine's packing. Lauren, all of 24 and radiating an effortless condescension, trailed her through the rooms, pointing at items with a manicured finger. "Richard said you could take the Wedgwood plates," Lauren chirped, examining her reflection in a gilded mirror. "The ones from his grandmother. It's a very generous gesture." Catherine looked at the plates, each one a memory of a tense family holiday she had navigated with painstaking diplomacy. They felt tainted. She packed only her clothes, her books, and a small, unassuming painting of a windswept coastline she had bought with her own money years before she'd met Richard. As she walked out of the service elevator for the last time, the doorman, a kind man named Patrick, who had always shared a friendly word, avoided her gaze. In Richard Beaumont's world, irrelevance was a communicable disease. She moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village, paid for with the first installment of her settlement. The change was jarring. The grandeur of Fifth Avenue was replaced by the rumble of the subway and the chatter of students from nearby NYU. For the first month, she did almost nothing. She existed in a grey fog of shock and grief, not just for her marriage, but for the years she had invested in a man who had valued her at nothing. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. She was trying to make sense of her finances, the settlement that was meant to last a lifetime, but felt terrifyingly finite. She spread the papers across her small dining table the same way she used to do with Richard's business files. And then she saw it. A footnote in a prospectus for a venture capital fund she'd once researched for him. It mentioned a burgeoning field, predictive data analytics for renewable energy grids. It was a sector deemed too niche, too volatile by major players like Beaumont Industries, who were still heavily invested in traditional energy. Richard had scoffed at it. Green energy is a charity project, Catherine, not a business. But looking at the data, the projected growth, the increasing government subsidies, Catherine saw something else. She saw a blind spot. Richard's blind spot. He was a titan, yes, but a titan from a dying era, too arrogant to see the shift coming. A tiny spark ignited within the fog. It was an idea fragile, but persistent. She spent the next week devouring everything she could find on the topic. She called professors, read white papers, and built financial models on a cheap laptop. The woman Richard had dismissed as a decorator was in secret a formidable researcher with an intuitive grasp of market dynamics. She had one last card to play, one connection Richard had never bothered to cultivate. Henry Wallace, a legendary semi-retired venture capitalist. Henry had been a friend of her father's. Richard had always found him dull, a relic from a bygone era of handshake deals and long-term vision. He had dismissed him as past his prime. Catherine knew better. Henry Wallace didn't invest in companies. He invested in people. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone. She had no company, no staff, and a business plan sketched out on legal pads. But she had an idea, and for the first time in a very long time, she had a flicker of hope. She was no longer Mrs. Beaumont. She was Catherine Davenport, and she was about to start building. The first meeting with Henry Wallace took place in a dusty book-lined office in a pre-war building overlooking Gramercy Park. The contrast with Richard's sleek, minimalist corporate headquarters was stark. Henry's office was a place of substance, not style. It smelled of old paper leather and pipe tobacco. Henry, a man in his late 70s, with eyes that had lost none of their sharpness, listened without interruption for nearly 2 hours. He leaned back in his worn leather chair, fingertips steepled as Catherine laid out her vision. She wasn't just talking about solar panels or wind turbines. She was talking about the brain behind them. She spoke of AI-driven software that could predict energy consumption spikes, reroute power from surplus grids to deficit areas in real time, and optimize battery storage to eliminate waste. She called her nascent company Nexus Solutions. Beaumont Industries and others like it, they see energy as a commodity to be extracted and sold. Catherine explained, her voice gaining confidence with every word. They are playing checkers. I want to play chess. The future isn't in generating power, it's in managing it intelligently. That's where the real value, the real revolution lies. She handed him a meticulously prepared folder containing market analysis, 5-year projections, and a lean, scalable business model. He took his time, turning each page slowly, his expression unreadable. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at her, a long, appraising stare. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. Richard is a fool, Henry said, his voice a low rumble. He always was. He inherited an empire and thinks he built it. He can't tell the difference between a balance sheet and a vision. He tapped the folder. This is a vision. He opened a drawer in his heavy oak desk and took out a checkbook. I'll provide the seed funding, not as a loan, but for a 20% stake. I'm not a banker, Catherine. I'm a partner. Tears pricked Catherine's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. This was not a moment for weakness. It was a moment of validation. Thank you, Henry. She managed, her voice thick with emotion. Don't thank me. He grunted, scribbling on the check. Make me money, and more importantly, prove that arrogant son of a bitch wrong. The next 2 years were a blur of relentless work. Catherine moved out of her Greenwich Village apartment and into a smaller, cheaper one in Astoria, Queens, pouring every cent of her settlement and Henry's investment into Nexus Solutions. Her first office was a shared workspace above a bakery where the smell of yeast and sugar mingled with the electric hum of servers. She hired a small, brilliant team of young engineers and data scientists, convincing them to take a chance on her vision, with a combination of passion and stock options. She was the first one in every morning and the last one out, often sleeping on a couch in the office. She learned to code, she negotiated with hardware suppliers, and she pitched to early adopter clients, municipal governments, and environmentally conscious corporations that Richard's company had long ignored. She was no longer the woman who planned parties. She was a CEO running on caffeine and conviction. Her big break came when she secured a pilot program with the city of Portland, Oregon. Nexus Solutions software was implemented across a section of their grid, and the results were staggering. Within 6 months, they had reduced energy waste by 18% and prevented 3 major blackouts during a summer heatwave. The case study went viral within the industry. Suddenly, Catherine Davenport was no longer a ghost. She was a name whispered in tech circles. Nexus Solutions began attracting attention and, more importantly, clients. A second round of funding, led by a prestigious Silicon Valley firm, valued her company at a figure that made her initial settlement from Richard look like pocket change. She moved Nexus Solutions into a proper office in the Flatiron district, a space filled with light plants and the vibrant energy of a company on the rise. She still worked punishing hours, but now there was a sense of momentum, of inevitability. She allowed herself small luxuries, like buying a new suit from the Row, not because it was a status symbol, but because it felt like armor. She rarely thought of Richard, except as a distant data point, a symbol of the old guard she was working to supplant. She never read the society pages anymore and had no idea what he was up to. Her world was no longer defined by his. It was defined by gigawatts data streams and the quiet satisfaction of building something real, something that mattered. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving completely off the radar of the world she had once inhabited. And that was exactly how she liked it. While Catherine was building her empire, in the light, Richard Beaumont was struggling to keep his from crumbling in the shadows. On the surface, nothing had changed. He was still a fixture at all the right restaurants, his pronouncements on the market were still quoted by Bloomberg, and Lauren was still a decorative accessory on his arm. But inside the glass and steel fortress of Beaumont Industries, the foundations were cracking. The source of the rot was a disastrous acquisition made 3 years prior. Richard, driven by ego, had overpaid for a legacy oil company in Texas, convinced he could squeeze out efficiencies and ride one last wave of fossil fuel profits. He had ignored the warnings of his own analysts, who pointed to shifting political winds and the unstoppable rise of renewables. The deal was a dud. The oil fields were less productive than promised, and new environmental regulations had turned the asset into a billion-dollar liability. Beaumont Industries was bleeding cash. The stock, once a blue-chip stalwart, was stagnating. The board was growing restless. Richard, for the first time in his life, felt the cold prickle of fear. He projected an aura of unshakable confidence, but his nights were sleepless, filled with the gnawing anxiety of failure. His lifeline, his one big play to reverse the tide, was Oratech. It was a small, privately held robotics and AI logistics company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Oratech wasn't glamorous, but their proprietary software was revolutionary. It could automate entire supply chains from warehouse to delivery with terrifying efficiency. For Beaumont Industries, which spent a fortune on logistics, for its myriad divisions, acquiring Oratech would slash costs by billions instantly, boosting their bottom line and dazzling Wall Street. It would be the masterstroke that secured his legacy. He'd been in aggressive private negotiations to buy the company for months. The founder, an eccentric MIT professor, was notoriously difficult, but Richard was confident his money could solve any problem. He saw it as a done deal. One afternoon, Henry Wallace called Catherine. His voice was calm, but she could detect an underlying urgency. "I'm hearing things, Catherine," he said. "Richard Beaumont is in trouble, deeper than anyone knows. He staked his entire reputation on acquiring a company called Auratech." Catherine felt a jolt. Auratech, the AI logistics firm? The very one. Their automation software is the best in the world. I know you've been looking at ways to streamline the hardware deployment side of Nexus. You should take a look at them. I have, Catherine admitted. We did a deep dive a few months ago. Their tech is brilliant. It could cut our installation and maintenance overhead by 40%. But they weren't for sale. The founder is particular. "Everyone has a price," Henry said, "and desperate men like Richard tend to make a lot of noise. He's been trying to bully them into a sale. It's not working. The founder doesn't like him. Perhaps he'd prefer a different kind of buyer, someone with a vision for the future, not someone trying to patch up the past." The implication hung in the air. This wasn't just about synergy or business strategy anymore. This was a crossroads. Auratech was the key to Richard's survival. It was also the key to catapulting Nexus Solutions into the next stratosphere. The two paths, which had diverged so completely, were about to collide. Catherine spent the next week in a whirlwind of secret activity. She flew to Boston on a private charter, a necessity she now saw as a business tool, not an indulgence. She didn't meet the Auratech founder in a boardroom. Instead, respecting his known eccentricities, she met him at the MIT Museum, surrounded by the history of innovation. His name was Dr. Aris Thorne, a man with a wild mane of white hair and a mind that moved at the speed of light. He had been stonewalling Richard for months, disgusted by his corporate raiding tactics. Catherine didn't talk about share prices or cost-cutting. She talked about the future. She showed him how his logistics AI could be integrated with her energy management AI to create truly smart, sustainable cities. She painted a picture of a world where his technology wasn't just making a dinosaur of a company more efficient, but was actively building a better, cleaner world. "Mr. Beaumont wants to use my life's work to make his shipping manifests cheaper," Dr. Thorne said, his eyes twinkling. "You want to use it to build the future." He didn't agree on the spot, but when Catherine flew back to New York, she knew she had planted a seed in fertile ground. Over the next few days, her lawyers, working in concert with Henry's team, drafted an offer. It was audacious, structured, with a mix of cash and a significant stake in the combined future entity of Nexus Aura. It was a partnership, not a conquest. The offer was sent. For 72 hours, there was silence. Catherine felt a tension she hadn't experienced since the early days of Nexus. On the third day, as she was reviewing schematics for a new project, an encrypted email arrived. It was from Dr. Thorne's legal team. They had accepted her offer. The deal was done. Nexus Solutions, the company, born from the ashes of her divorce, had just acquired the one asset Richard Beaumont needed to save himself. And no one, least of all Richard, knew a thing. The contracts were signed under a strict non-disclosure agreement, with the official announcement to be made in 1 week's time at the annual Metropolitan Innovators Gala, where the keynote speaker was, until now, a closely guarded secret. The Metropolitan Innovators Gala was the glittering apex of the New York business and tech calendar. It was a night of self-congratulation, of hushed deals made over champagne, and of a carefully calibrated social hierarchy on full display. Richard Beaumont was in his element. He stood near the center of the vast starlit ballroom at the Museum of Modern Art, a glass of vintage Dom Perignon in his hand, Lauren clinging to his arm like a designer handbag. He was holding court, his voice booming over the polite murmur of the crowd. He felt invincible tonight. The final papers for the Auratech acquisition were, he believed, being drawn up. His lawyers had assured him the reclusive founder was just playing hard to get, that their latest overwhelming cash offer would be irresistible. Tonight was a victory lap. He was Richard Beaumont, and he always won. Then across the room, he saw her, Catherine. He hadn't seen her in person in almost 3 years. She looked different. The expensive, sometimes frivolous fashion of her past life was gone, replaced by a simple, exquisitely cut black gown by Narciso Rodriguez. It was severe, elegant, and utterly commanding. She wasn't dripping in diamonds. Her only jewelry was a pair of subtle platinum earrings. She looked formidable. A flicker of something unpleasant, an emotion he couldn't name went through him. She was speaking with Henry Wallace, the old relic. Richard scoffed internally. Of course. The washed-up investor and the washed-up wife. A perfect pair. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp British accent. Mr. Beaumont, Olivia Monroe, Financial Times. And Richard turned his public smile, snapping into place. Olivia Monroe was a piranha, a reporter, known for her incisive, often brutal, business reporting. Ms. Monroe, he said smoothly, enjoying the party? Immensely, she replied, her eyes sharp. I was hoping for a comment on the rumors swirling around Beaumont Industries, the whispers of a liquidity crisis, and your rather aggressive, some might say, desperate pursuit of Oratech. Richard's smile tightened. The directness of the question in this public forum was a clear attack. He could feel the ears of those around him perking up. He needed to deflect, to reassert his dominance. And then his eyes fell on Catherine again. She was the perfect scapegoat, an easy target to re-establish his own superiority. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a performance, and he threw his head back to make sure everyone saw it. Desperate! He boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. He deliberately raised his arm and pointed directly at Catherine across the room. 100 heads turned to follow his gesture. You're asking me about desperation. Catherine, who had been deep in conversation, looked up, her expression turning from confusion to disbelief as she saw she was the center of a sudden, unwelcome spotlight. Richard's voice carried across the ballroom. If you want to know about financial trouble, you should be asking her for advice. Last I heard, she was decorating shoebox apartments in Queens. Maybe she can give you tips on how to stretch a budget. A wave of uncomfortable laughter and shocked murmurs rippled through this elite crowd. It was a stunningly cruel public humiliation. Lauren giggled beside him, squeezing his arm. Richard felt a surge of triumph. He had turned the tables, belittled the reporter, and put his ex-wife in her place all in one stroke. He was the king of this jungle. Catherine stood frozen for a moment, the blood draining from her face. The stares of hundreds of people felt like physical blows. She could see the pity, the morbid curiosity, the faint smirks. She saw Richard, puffed up with arrogance, soaking in his petty victory. For a split second, the old, powerless Catherine threatened to surface. But then something else took over. A cold, quiet calm. She simply held his gaze from across the room, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say a word. She just had to wait. It was at that exact moment that a new sound began to permeate the ballroom. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping, barely perceptible over the string quartet. But it grew steadily louder, a deep, percussive hump, hump, whump that vibrated through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the museum's sculpture garden. The conversations faltered. Heads turned from Catherine, tilting upwards towards the source of the sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter not passing over, but descending and descending fast, somewhere very close by. All eyes, including a bewildered Richards, swiveled to the windows. The flashing navigation lights of a sleek black Sikorsky S-76 sliced through the night sky as it prepared to land on the helipad of the skyscraper adjacent to the museum. The string quartet trailed off into an awkward silence, completely drowned out. The entire gala, the titans of finance, the tech gurus, the society mavens, was now captivated by this unscheduled arrival. The cameras of the press, which had just been trained on Richard's mocking face, now turned as one pointing their long lenses towards the drama unfolding outside. Richard stared confused. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. On the stage at the far end of the ballroom, the night's master of ceremonies, a well-known news anchor, hurried to the podium, a frantic-looking assistant, whispering in his ear. He tapped the microphone, his professional composure visibly rattled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice straining to be heard over the now idling rotor wash. We, um, we have a slight change to our program. It appears our keynote speaker, the anonymous benefactor of tonight's gala, has just arrived." A wave of excited murmurs swept the room. The identity of the benefactor had been the biggest mystery of the night. Richard felt a pang of annoyance. Who had the gall to upstage his moment? Then the MC continued, his voice filled with a newfound awe. "It is my profound honor to be the first to publicly announce two monumental pieces of news. First, the acquisition of Auratech has just been finalized. And second, please join me in welcoming the architect of that deal, the visionary founder and CEO of Nexus Solutions, Ms. Catherine Davenport." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Time seemed to slow down. Richard Beaumont's smug, triumphant expression collapsed as if it were a building imploding in on itself. His face cycled through a rapid series of emotions: confusion, denial, dawning comprehension, and finally a mask of ashen horror. The Dom Perignon glass slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the polished floor, the sound lost in the stunned silence. Lauren looked from Richard's pale face to the stage, her mouth agape. "Catherine, you're Catherine," she whispered, the pieces not quite fitting together in her mind. All eyes which had been on the helicopter now snapped back to the woman in the simple black dress. Catherine Davenport, the woman Richard had just publicly ridiculed as a failure, was the mystery benefactor, the keynote speaker, the new owner of the very company he had staked his future on. It was a plot twist so audacious, so theatrical, it felt ripped from a Hollywood script. As if on cue, a side door near the stage opened. Catherine, who had slipped out of the main room unnoticed during the commotion, reappeared. She had not arrived in the helicopter. That was pure stagecraft, a power move orchestrated by Henry to perfection. She had been there all along, waiting. She walked towards the stage with a steady, unhurried grace, her heels clicking with quiet authority on the marble floor. The sea of billionaires and power brokers parted for her as if she were royalty. The camera flashes were blinding, a strobing, frantic volley of light that followed her every step. The reporters, led by a voraciously scribbling Olivia Monroe, scrambled for a better position. This wasn't just a business story anymore. It was the stuff of legend. Catherine ascended the small set of stairs to the stage. She shook the MC's hand and gave a small, polite nod to the stunned audience. She adjusted the microphone, her movements calm and deliberate. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze sweeping over them, before landing just for a moment on Richard. He looked small, shrunken. A man drowning in the wreckage of his own arrogance. She offered no smirk, no sign of triumph. Her expression was one of serene, implacable pure. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the cavernous space. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. My partner, Henry Wallace, has a flair for the theatrical." A small, knowing laugh rippled through the audience as they glanced at the beaming Henry. "Some of you may remember me from a different life," she continued, her tone even. "A life of galas, much like this one, though my role was somewhat different then. But I'm not here tonight to talk about the past. I am here to talk about the future." She didn't mention Richard. She didn't need to. Every single person in that room was filling in the blanks. Her speech was a masterclass in substance over spectacle, though the spectacle of her presence was overwhelming. She spoke with passion and precision about the synergy between Nexus Solutions and Auratech. She laid out a vision for an integrated future of smart grids powered by sustainable energy and managed by an intelligent logistics network that eliminated waste at every level. For too long, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, the titans of industry have focused on extraction, extracting resources from the earth and extracting value for shareholders. They have operated from a mindset of scarcity and zero-sum games. But the future is not about extraction. It's about creation. It's about integration. It's about building systems that are not just profitable, but sustainable and intelligent. That is the mission of the new combined entity of Nexus and Aura. Richard stood paralyzed, the shattered glass at his feet, a perfect metaphor for his world. Every word Catherine spoke was a nail in his coffin. She hadn't just bought the company he needed. She had articulated a vision for the future that made him and his entire business model sound like a fossil. He was the past. She was undeniably the future. The board members of Beaumont Industries who were present in the room were studiously avoiding his gaze, their faces grim. They were already calculating the fallout. When Catherine finished her speech, the room, after a beat of stunned silence, erupted in thunderous applause. It was genuine, effusive, and long. It was the sound of a new queen being crowned. She gave a final, gracious nod and walked off the stage, not back towards the crowd, but towards the side exit, where Henry was waiting for her. Her work here was done. As she passed, she was intercepted by Olivia Munro, the reporter's eyes shining with professional zeal. Ms. Davenport, an incredible coup. Do you have any comment for Mr. Beaumont, who so publicly mocked you just moments before your announcement? Catherine paused. She looked past the reporter, her gaze sweeping over the chaotic room until it found Richard one last time. He looked utterly broken. She then turned back to Olivia, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. No comment, she said, her voice soft but firm. Mr. Beaumont has made his position quite clear, and tonight I've made mine. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the world to digest the story of the woman who had been laughed out of the room only to return and buy the building. The dawn that broke over New York City was mercilessly clear. For Richard Beaumont, it illuminated the wreckage of his life with crystalline precision. He woke on a silk sofa in his cavernous living room, the memory of the gala a toxic sludge in his mind. The penthouse was silent. Lauren was gone. On the marble kitchen island, a single sheet of her personalized stationery was left next to her discarded engagement ring. The note was short and brutal. I can't be associated with this. Don't call me. He stumbled towards his phone, dreading what he would find. The screen flared to life with a digital scream, 312 missed calls, over 1,000 notifications. At the top of the feed was Olivia Munro's article for the Financial Times. The headline, already syndicated across the globe, was a dagger, the gala, the helicopter, and the humiliation. How Catherine Davenport redefined corporate revenge. Below it, a split-screen photo on the left. Richard, his face a mask of arrogant mockery as he pointed across the room. On the right, Catherine on the stage, poised and powerful. He looked like a bully, a fool. She looked like a queen. His thumb trembled as he opened his stock app. In pre-market trading, Beaumont Industries, BEA, was in a catastrophic vertical dive, down 42%. Billions in market capitalization had evaporated overnight, based on a single moment of public hubris. His legacy, his family's name, was being immolated on the pyre of his ego. Then the phone rang. It was Robert Caldwell, the lead independent director of his board, a man Richard had played golf with for 20 years. Robert, Richard began, his voice a dry croak. It was a spectacle, I know, but we can manage the narrative. There is no narrative to manage, Richard. Robert's voice was like ice water. There was no familiarity, no friendship, only the cold calculus of corporate survival. The board convened an emergency teleconference an hour ago. We have lost all faith in your leadership. Your actions were not just embarrassing, they were a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. You publicly attacked the very individual who held the key to our company's future, a fact you were clearly unaware of. It demonstrates a level of recklessness that is indefensible. Robert, you can't. This is not a discussion. It's a notification. Caldwell cut him off coldly. There will be a formal meeting at 4 p.m. We expect your resignation. If you refuse, the board is unanimous in its decision to terminate for cause. Your security credentials for the building have already been revoked. A courier will deliver the relevant documents this morning. The line went dead. He was locked out, a prisoner in his own penthouse. He stared at the phone in his hand, this sleek, black obelisk that connected him to the world, and felt an overwhelming urge to destroy it. With a roar of pure, impotent rage, he hurled it against a wall of Italian marble, where it shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. The silence that returned was absolute, the silence of a tomb. Across the city, in an apartment overlooking the Flatiron district, Catherine Davenport's morning was the mirror opposite. She had been awake since 5, not reveling in victory, but immersed in the complex schematics of Oratech's server architecture. Her world hadn't stopped for celebration. It had accelerated. Her own phone was buzzing incessantly, but for entirely different reasons. Her investors from Silicon Valley called their voices giddy with excitement. The board of Nexus Solutions called, offering effusive congratulations. Her company's stock, on the cusp of its own public offering, was now one of the most anticipated IPOs in a decade. Her response to each caller was the same gracious calm and relentlessly forward-looking. "Thank you, Mark, I appreciate it," she said to a prominent venture capitalist. "But the real work starts now. I'm looking at the integration plan for the Cambridge team. I'd like to schedule a call to discuss revised Q3 projections." Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, stood in the doorway of her home office, looking overwhelmed. "The media requests are insane," Sarah said. "Every major network wants an exclusive. Time wants to put you on the cover. Olivia Munro has called 5 times. Catherine looked up from her screen, her expression thoughtful. "Decline them all for now, Sarah. Please issue a single statement. Say that my priority is the well-being and integration of the employees of both Nexus Solutions and Oratech. This isn't about me. It's about the powerful future we are all going to build together." Her focus was a shield. By refusing to engage with the personal drama, she elevated the entire narrative. This wasn't a soap opera. It was a paradigm shift, and she was its architect. Later that morning, Henry Wallace found her, not in her executive suite, but in a glass-walled conference room, a whiteboard marker in her hand, deep in a technical debate with her 2 lead engineers. The office around them was buzzing with a joyful electric energy. Henry waited patiently, holding 2 cups of coffee. When she finally took a break, he handed one to her, along with a copy of the Wall Street Journal. The story was above the fold. "They're calling you the Quiet Titan," he said, his eyes twinkling. "A much better moniker than the one in the Post. They're calling you the Matriarch of Vengeance." Catherine glanced at the headline and frowned. "Vengeance is a fire that consumes the person who wields it, Henry. It's an emotional indulgence. This was never that. It was a strategic acquisition of a critical asset that an opponent foolishly undervalued and publicly insulted. The personal history simply provided the context." "The world doesn't see it that way." Henry smiled. "My phone has been ringing off the hook. A dozen of Richard's old rivals want to send you cases of champagne to celebrate his demise. Tell them to send their donations to the MIT Scholarship Fund instead," she said without hesitation. "We don't celebrate another's ruin, Henry. We celebrate our own success. There is a fundamental difference." She walked to the window looking out over the city. She could see the top of the Beaumont Industries Tower in the distance, a monument to a fading era. She felt no thrill, no surge of victorious adrenaline. She felt a quiet finality. Richard's greatest mistake, she realized, was not just his arrogance, but his inability to see beyond the personal. To him, business was a conquest, a war of egos. For her, it had become an act of creation. There are two balance sheets in life, she said, her voice soft but firm. The one you show your investors with profits and losses written in black and red ink. And then there's the unwritten one, the one that measures value and worth. Richard's unwritten balance sheet was now catastrophically in the red, his assets of pride and power revealed as toxic liabilities. Her own, she knew, was just beginning to show its true value. And it had nothing to do with Richard Beaumont's failure, and everything to do with her own hard-won success. Her victory wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of hers. 3 months after the Metropolitan Innovators Gala, the name Catherine Davenport had become synonymous with a new kind of power. She was on the cover of Forbes magazine, not in a gown, but in a hard hat at a Nexus Aura construction site. The headline, bold and unequivocal, "The Disruptor." How Catherine Davenport built a clean energy empire and rewrote the rules. The story of the gala had become a modern business legend, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms about the dangers of hubris. For Catherine, however, the legend was a distraction. The real work was in the day-to-day grind of merging two distinct corporate cultures. Auratech's Cambridge-based academics and Nexus Solutions' scrappy New York engineers were a potent but volatile mix. Her days were a marathon of integration meetings, logistical analyses, and strategic planning sessions. She thrived on it. The complexities of building the company left little room for dwelling on the past. Richard Beaumont had been relegated to a closed file, a historical data point in her own stunning rise. The company Richard had left behind, Beaumont Industries, was in its death throes. Picked apart by activist investors and crushed by debt, it was being sold for scrap. Divisions were being shuttered or auctioned off to the highest bidder. It was a predictable end, and Catherine paid it little mind. Then the message came. It wasn't an email or a call, but a formal letter delivered by courier, written on the letterhead of a law firm she didn't recognize. It was from the trustee, managing the liquidation of Richard Beaumont's personal assets. The letter was circumspect, stating that Mr. Beaumont requested a brief private meeting to discuss a matter of profound personal and ethical importance. She tossed the letter onto her desk, annoyed at the intrusion. Her first instinct was to ignore it. What could they possibly have to discuss? That evening, she mentioned it to Henry during their weekly dinner. "He wants a meeting," she said, swirling the wine in her glass. Henry Wallace put down his fork, his expression hardening. "Don't do it, Catherine. There is absolutely nothing to be gained. You won. The story is over. Let him fade away. Any meeting will be a trap, a plea for money, a pathetic attempt at absolution, or worse, an effort to drag you back into his toxic orbit." "I know," Catherine said, staring into the candle's flame. "Logically, you're right. So you're going to ignore it." She was silent for a long moment. "I don't think I can," she admitted more to herself than to him. "It feels unfinished. Not for him, for me. I need to close the file myself, not just let it gather dust." Henry sighed, recognizing the same quiet determination that had convinced him to fund her impossible idea years ago. "If you must," he conceded, "then you control everything. The time, the place, the terms. No audience, no witnesses. And you walk away the second it serves no purpose." Catherine chose the Blue Bar at the Algonquin Hotel for the meeting. It was a place steeped in history, but quiet and discreet on a weekday afternoon. It was neutral ground belonging to neither her world nor the one she had shared with Richard. She arrived first, choosing a small secluded table in a dark corner. She ordered a sparkling water and waited, feeling a strange calm, the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a final, predictable chemical reaction. He was 10 minutes late. When he walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. The Richard Beaumont who approached her table was a ghost of the man who had pointed at her and laughed. The bespoke suits and confident swagger were gone. He wore a simple, slightly ill-fitting blazer and slacks. His face was gaunt, the skin sallow, and his eyes, once alight with arrogance, were hollowed out and haunted. He looked 20 years older. The Titan had become a spectre. "Catherine," he said, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. He gestured awkwardly to the chair opposite her. "Thank you for coming." She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "You said this was a matter of importance." A waiter approached, and Richard flinched, almost startled by the attention. He ordered a coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "I'm not here to ask for anything for myself," he began, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. "I know what I did, what I said, the cruelty of it. I see it now. I was a fool, blinded by pride. I deserve everything that's happened to me." And Catherine remained silent, offering no comfort, no absolution. This was his confession, not a negotiation. "But it's not about me," he continued, finally, looking up. His eyes were filled with a raw, desperate plea she had never seen before. "It's about the company. Not my company anymore, I know that. But the original Beaumont Industrial Works. The one my grandfather started in a garage in Pittsburgh. It's about the people." He explained that while the oil and gas divisions were being sold off to competitors, one part of the company was about to be obliterated entirely, the Advanced Materials and Renewables Division. It was a small, underfunded R&D unit that his own father had started, a passion project that Richard had always dismissed as a waste of resources. They had been working on next-generation battery technology and lightweight composite materials for wind turbines. "The liquidators are just going to shut it down," he said, his voice cracking. "Fire everyone. Sell the patents for pennies on the dollar to some overseas conglomerate. There are 250 employees in that division, Catherine. Brilliant scientists, engineers. People who have been with the company for decades. Their work is important. It was the one part of the company that was actually trying to build something for the future, and I ignored it." Catherine felt a sudden, sharp jolt of interest that cut through her detachment. She knew of the division. Her own team had tried to recruit some of their talent, but the engineers were famously loyal to the Beaumont legacy, if not to Richard himself. "I'm asking you to look at it," he pleaded, leaning forward. "Nexus Aura is the only company that would understand what they're doing. You could buy it, not as a favor to me. God, no. But because it's valuable. Because their work complements yours. You could save it, save their research, save their jobs. Let my family's name mean something more than just my failure." Here it was, the ultimate irony. The man who had defined her as a mere decorator was now begging her to recognize the value in a part of his own empire that he himself had been too blind to see. He wasn't asking for a handout. He was presenting her with a business opportunity, the last and only valuable card he had left to play. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see the monster who had tried to destroy her. She saw a broken man trying to salvage a single piece of honor from the wreckage of his life. "I will have my team conduct their due diligence," she said, her voice cool and professional. "If the assets are viable and the price is fair, we will consider making an offer to the trustees." Relief washed over Richard's face so profoundly that he seemed to deflate. Tears welled in his eyes, and he quickly looked away, embarrassed. "Thank you," he whispered. "That's all I can ask." He stood to leave, a man with nothing left to say. As he turned, he paused. "For what it's worth, Catherine," he said, not looking at her. "I'm sorry. For everything." He walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the city's afternoon crowds. Catherine sat for a long time, the ice in her water melting completely. Henry had been wrong. The meeting had not been a trap. It had been something far more complex, a reckoning. The due diligence was swift and aggressive. Catherine's team discovered that the Beaumont Renewables division was, as Richard had claimed, a hidden gem. Their battery chemistry patents were potentially revolutionary years ahead of the market. Richard, in his obsession with fossil fuels, had been sitting on a gold mine and hadn't even known it. 2 weeks later, the board of Nexus Aura unanimously approved the acquisition. The press release was simple and strategic, highlighting the synergy and the value of the patents. It mentioned in passing that the move would save over 200 jobs in Pittsburgh. There was no mention of Richard Beaumont. On the day the deal closed, Catherine was working late. The city lights twinkled outside her panoramic window. Her office was quiet, the hum of the servers, a comforting reminder of the machine she had built. Her gaze fell upon the painting of the windswept coastline, the one she had bought in a life before Richard, a symbol of a freedom she had once known and had now reclaimed on a scale she could never have imagined. She thought of Richard's apology. She felt no need to accept it or reject it. It was his burden, not hers. Her actions acquiring the division, saving the jobs, harnessing the technology, were not about him. They were not about forgiveness or revenge. They were the logical, strategic, and ultimately the right moves for her company, for the future she was building. She had won the war at the gala. But in the quiet of this hotel bar and the sterile language of an acquisition agreement, she had won the peace. She had proven that true power wasn't the ability to crush your enemies. It was the ability to build an empire so strong, so visionary, and so fundamentally sound that it could absorb the best parts of your enemy's legacy and make them your own, all while leaving the broken man behind. Her balance sheet wasn't just profitable, it was for the first time whole. And so Catherine Davenport's ascent was complete, not with a bitter laugh, but with the quiet hum of a well-earned empire. This wasn't just a story of revenge. It was a powerful testament to resilience, intelligence, and the incredible strength of a person who refuses to be defined by how others see them. Richard Beaumont didn't lose because he was outplayed in business. He lost because he fundamentally misunderstood the value of the person he threw away. Catherine's story reminds us that the ultimate power lies not in tearing someone else down, but in building yourself up far beyond their reach. What did you think of Catherine's epic comeback? Do you believe Richard got what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this incredible story of triumph, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life dramas that will leave you breathless. What happens when the man who threw you away is forced to watch you ascend to a world he can only dream of? For years, Ethan Carter told anyone who would listen that his ex-wife, Olivia, was a career-obsessed workaholic who didn't know the first thing about being a partner. He had his new perfect fiancée, Maddie, the ultimate wife material. He was the winner. But then a single headline shattered his carefully constructed reality. A headline that announced Olivia not just as successful, but as the bride of one of the world's most enigmatic billionaires. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the story of what happens when a man's ego writes checks his reality can't cash. Ethan Carter had a sermon, and he delivered it with the passion of a convert. He preached it at backyard barbecues over craft beers, in hushed tones at upscale restaurants, and in casual asides to his colleagues in the polished corridors of his mid-level finance firm. The gospel was simple. He had finally found true happiness, and its name was Madison Hayes. Maddie, he'd say, a contented smile playing on his lips. She just gets it. She understands what a man needs at the end of a long day. He'd usually be holding Maddie's hand when he said this, her presence serving as Exhibit A in the case for his newfound enlightenment. She was pretty, with a girl-next-door charm, a sprinkle of freckles, and a laugh that was always ready and willing. She worked as a part-time yoga instructor and was training to be a nutritionist. Her ambitions were wholesome, manageable. They didn't threaten to eclipse his own. The unspoken, yet deafeningly loud counterpoint to this sermon was his ex-wife, Olivia Rossi. He rarely used her name. She was simply my ex. The adjectives he attached to her were starkly different: driven, intense, always on, and his personal favourite, just not nurturing. You know, a man wants a partner, not a competitor. He explained to his friend Mark one Saturday as they stood over a grill, the scent of sizzling burgers filling the air. Maddie was inside, laughing with Mark's wife, her silhouette visible through the kitchen window. My ex, she couldn't switch off. We'd be in bed and she'd be scrolling through market trends on her phone. She'd forget to pick up the dry cleaning because she was closing a deal. The house never felt like a home. It felt like a launch pad for her career. Mark nodded, slowly, flipping a patty. She was always smart, though. Smart isn't everything, Ethan retorted, a little too quickly. What's the point of a brilliant mind if it can't remember your anniversary? Maddie made me a 3-course meal for our 6-month dating anniversary. From scratch. That's wife material. That was his favourite phrase, wife material. Maddie was the embodiment of it. She organised their social calendar, remembered his mother's birthday, and made sure his favourite brand of coffee was always in the cupboard. Her world seemed to revolve around building a comfortable, supportive life for him, for them. She admired his work at the firm, listened intently to his stories about office politics, and soothed his ego when a deal went south. She was the calm harbour to his ex-wife's stormy sea. Their divorce had been finalised 2 years ago, and in Ethan's retelling, it was an amicable, logical conclusion. We just wanted different things, he'd say with a shrug. I wanted a family, a home. She wanted a boardroom. He omitted the screaming matches the nights he'd come home to an empty house, not because Olivia was closing a deal, but because she couldn't bear to be in the same room as him. He forgot the way he'd belittled her ambitions, calling her small startup project a cute little hobby. Someone he had convinced himself, and was working tirelessly to convince everyone else, that the failure of his marriage was entirely on Olivia. It was a failure of her femininity, her priorities, her very nature. His engagement to Maddie was his vindication. The 1-carat cushion-cut diamond on her finger was a trophy. Their life together was a portrait of domestic bliss curated for public consumption. Ethan's Instagram was a gallery of their happiness. Maddie laughing as she kneaded dough in their pristine kitchen, the two of them clinking wine glasses on their balcony overlooking the city. A selfie snuggled on the couch with the caption, "Nothing better than a quiet night in with my fiancé. Shh, wife material, blessed." His friends mostly bought into it. They saw how relaxed Ethan seemed, how much he smiled. They saw Maddie's adoration for him. If they had private reservations, if they remembered the vibrant, witty Olivia and felt a pang of something missing, they kept it to themselves. It was easier to celebrate the new improved Ethan than to question the narrative he was so carefully crafting. One evening, about 6 months into their engagement, Ethan and Maddie were hosting a small dinner party. His boss, Mr. Henderson, and his wife were the guests of honour. Maddie, a gracious host, had prepared an elaborate meal of roast chicken and Dauphinoise potatoes. "Ethan, you are a lucky man," Mr. Henderson said, raising his glass of Pinot Noir. "Madison, this meal is divine. My wife hasn't cooked a meal like this in 20 years. Maddie blushed prettily. "I love taking care of my man." Ethan beamed, placing a proprietary hand on her shoulder. "She's one of a kind. Traditional values. You know how rare that is these days." "Henderson," he shot a meaningful look at his boss. "Some women are so focused on shattering glass ceilings, they forget how to build a foundation at home." It was a direct, albeit anonymous shot at Olivia. He knew Henderson had met Olivia a few times at old company functions and had been impressed by her sharpness. This was Ethan's way of course-correcting that impression, of solidifying his new brand. Later that night, as they cleaned up, Maddie turned to him, her expression earnest. "Did you really mean that? About traditional values?" "Of course I did," he said, kissing her forehead. "You're everything I've ever wanted. You make me happy, Maddie. My ex. She made me tired." Maddie leaned into him, satisfied with the answer. She didn't question the comparison. She accepted it as a compliment, a testament to her own worth in his eyes. She was the woman who had healed him, the one who had succeeded, where the brilliant Olivia Rossi had failed. She had no reason to believe otherwise. Ethan's world was perfectly ordered, his past neatly filed away as a cautionary tale, and his future with his perfect wife material, fiancée, stretching out before him like a calm, sunlit road. He was the protagonist of his own story, the wise man who had made the right choice. And for a little while longer he was allowed to believe it. The illusion of Ethan's victory, so meticulously constructed, was incinerated on a Tuesday morning by the cold blue light of 1,000 screens. It didn't happen in a vacuum. For weeks, a certain name had been bubbling up in the financial news circuits Ethan monitored. Obsessively, Damien Thorne. Thorne was a spectre in the world of high finance and tech, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire from the ground up before he was 35. He was notoriously private. There were maybe 3 or 4 authenticated photos of him in existence, all of them grainy and years old. He gave no interviews, attended no galas, and his company, Ethelred Industries, operated with a level of secrecy that was the stuff of legend. Thorne wasn't just rich, he was a myth. Ethan and his colleagues spoke of Damien Thorne in the same way ancient mariners might have spoken of a kraken, with a mixture of awe, terror, and disbelief. He was a market mover, a kingmaker. A single rumoured investment from him could send a stock soaring. On that particular Tuesday, Ethan was in a mid-morning meeting presenting quarterly projections with his usual slick confidence. His phone, which he'd placed face down on the polished mahogany table, began to vibrate. Not a single buzz, but a frantic, insistent series of them. Mark, sitting beside him, shot him a questioning look. Ethan subtly shook his head, trying to maintain focus on his PowerPoint slide. But the buzzing didn't stop. It was a cascade of notifications and digital avalanche. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. He was in the middle of a sentence about market penetration when his boss, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. "Ethan, is everything all right?" Henderson asked, his eyes gesturing towards the vibrating phone. "Sounds like you're a popular man this morning." A few colleagues chuckled. Flustered, Ethan mumbled an apology and silenced the device. But the seed of unease had been planted. His presentation faltered, his smooth delivery becoming slightly stilted. He rushed through the last few slides, his mind now preoccupied with the silent, insistent phone in his pocket. When the meeting finally adjourned, Ethan snatched the phone. The lock screen was a chaotic mosaic of notifications. Texts from Mark, his college buddies, his sister. A dozen alerts from news apps. He swiped it open, his thumb hovering over the messages. The first one he saw was from Mark, a simple explosive link to a Forbes article. Above the link, Mark had typed a single sentence. "Ethan, you are not going to believe this." He clicked the link. The page loaded, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The headline was stark black and brutal. It read, "A power union, reclusive billionaire, Damien Thorne, to marry tech CEO, Olivia Rossi." Ethan's breath hitched. It couldn't be. His Olivia. No, there must be another Olivia Rossi, who was a tech CEO. It was a common enough name. He scrolled down his heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. And then he saw the picture. It was a professional photograph, stunning in its intimacy and power. Damien Thorne, no longer a grainy myth, but a startlingly handsome man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a jawline that could cut glass, stood with his arm around a woman. But it was the woman who stole Ethan's breath. It was Olivia. But it was an Olivia he had never seen before. The woman in the photo was radiant, her dark hair styled in sleek waves, her smile not the tired, strained one he remembered, but wide and genuine. She was wearing a simple but exquisitely tailored emerald green dress that highlighted the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just standing next to Damien Thorne. She was his equal, her posture exuding a confidence that bordered on regal. She looked powerful. She looked happy. She looked utterly devastatingly untouchable. His Olivia. CEO Olivia Rossi. The article was a paean to their success. It detailed Thorne's legendary status and then introduced Olivia as the undisputed visionary behind Innovate Forward, a startup that had in just 2 years become a leader in sustainable AI. It spoke of her genius, her unrelenting drive, and her recent multi-billion-dollar valuation after securing a revolutionary patent. The company he had called a cute little hobby was now being hailed as a world-changing enterprise. The article mentioned her background, her summa cum laude degree from Stanford, her early work at a top consulting firm. It even included a brief cutting sentence. Rossi, who is divorced, founded Innovate Forward shortly after the dissolution of her first marriage, channeling her formidable energy into her professional ambitions. The words hit him like a physical blow. Channeling her formidable energy. They made it sound like their divorce had been the catalyst for her greatness, the removal of an obstacle, the removal of him. He sank into his office chair, the world around him, muffled as if he were underwater. The fluorescent lights of the office seemed too bright, the air too thin. He clicked on another link, this one to Vogue. The headline was even worse. The wedding of the decade inside Damien Thorne and Olivia Rossi's ultra-private engagement. More photos. Olivia laughing on a yacht, her hand in Thorne's. A close-up of the ring, a colossal flawless sapphire that made Maddie's diamond look like a speck of dust. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from his mother. "Ethan, did you see the news about Olivia Goodness? I suppose all that time she spent on her computer paid off." Even his mother's words, meant to be a form of awkward consolation, felt like a jab. He thought of all the things he had said. "She's not nurturing. She doesn't know how to build a home. I need a partner, not a competitor." He had painted her as a failure in the one arena he deemed important, being a wife. And now the world was celebrating her, not just for her career, but for landing the most elusive, powerful bachelor on the planet. She hadn't just failed to be his wife. She had leveled up to become a billionaire's bride. His carefully constructed narrative, the gospel he had preached so fervently, had been torn to shreds and set on fire. He wasn't the winner who had wisely traded up. He was the fool who had let a diamond slip through his fingers because he was too blind to see its worth. He was the man who had complained about the rain, only to find out the woman he'd left behind had learned to command the storm. The man who championed wife material had just discovered his ex-wife was made of stardust and steel. The door to his office opened, and Mark poked his head in his face, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "Buddy, you okay?" Ethan looked up, his face pale, the Forbes article still burning on his screen. He couldn't form words. All he could do was stare at the picture of Olivia, the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had so confidently dismissed, now smiling at the world from an unattainable height. The news of Olivia's engagement didn't just break Ethan's ego, it haunted him. Olivia Rossi became a ghost in his machine, a phantom presence that permeated every corner of his life, turning his domestic bliss with Maddie into a stage play where he was forgetting his lines. His obsession started subtly. It began with a late-night Google search, then another. Soon he had set up alerts for her name for Damien Thorne's, for Innovate Forward. His phone, once a tool for work and a gallery of his life with Maddie, became a shrine to his ex-wife's success. He consumed every article, every blog post, every paparazzi photo he could find. He saw Olivia and Damien leaving a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris. He saw them at a tech conference in Kyoto, where Olivia was the keynote speaker. He saw a candid shot of them on a windswept Scottish moor, reportedly near the castle Thorne had recently purchased. In every image, Olivia glowed. The fatigue that had perpetually lived under her eyes during their marriage was gone, replaced by a vibrant, focused energy. She wasn't just beautiful, she was formidable. Ethan started to draw comparisons, a slow, toxic poison seeping into his relationship with Maddie. One evening, Maddie was excitedly telling him about a new vegetarian lasagna recipe she had perfected. "It's amazing, Ethan. I used a cashew-based cheese, and you can't even tell the difference. It's so much healthier," she said, her eyes bright with pride. A year ago, he would have praised her, called her a culinary genius, and posted a picture of it with the hashtag #HadWifeMaterial. Now, his mind superimposed a different image over the scene. He remembered an article he'd read that morning. Olivia Rossi, CEO of Innovate Forward, addresses the World Economic Forum on the future of sustainable food production. "That's great, Mads," he said, his voice flat. He pushed the lasagna around his plate. "Really great." Maddie's smile faltered. "You don't like it?" "No, it's delicious, just got a lot on my mind from work." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He wasn't thinking about work. He was thinking about Olivia addressing world leaders while he was eating vegan lasagna. The thought was so absurd, so galling, it soured the taste of the food in his mouth. The ghost of Olivia was present in their conversations too. He would find himself replaying arguments from their marriage, but with a horrifying new clarity. He began to remember the things he had chosen to forget. Flashback. 3 years ago, their old apartment. Olivia is sitting at their small dining table, which is covered in schematics and financial projections. She hasn't slept in 2 days. Her eyes are red-rimmed, but blazing with excitement. "Ethan, look at this," she says, her voice thrumming with energy. "I've streamlined the energy conversion process. The efficiency gain is almost 12 This is it. This is the breakthrough." Ethan glances over from the TV where he's watching a football game. He sees a mess of papers, not a breakthrough. "That's nice, honey. Hey, did you remember to call the plumber about the leaky faucet I reminded you this morning?" Her face falls. The fire in her eyes dims to a hurt flicker. No, I'm sorry, I forgot. I was so caught up in this." "But Ethan, this is huge. This could get us our first round of seed funding." He scoffs, turning back to the game. "Liv, it's a hobby, a cute little project. How many of these breakthroughs have you had? Let's be realistic. Real people have to deal with real-life things, like leaky faucets." The memory was so vivid it made him flinch. He hadn't just been dismissive. He had been cruel. He had taken her passion and belittled it into a childish pastime. Her cute little project was now valued at over $5 billion. He had complained about a leaky faucet while she was trying to build an ark. Maddie began to notice the change. He was distant, irritable. The adoring gaze he once fixed on her now seemed to look straight through her. He stopped posting about her on social media. The wife material, compliments, dried up completely. One Saturday morning, she found him staring at his laptop, his face a mask of grim fascination. She crept up behind him and saw what he was looking at, a lengthy profile of Olivia in Wired magazine. It was filled with quotes from her colleagues praising her leadership and vision. "Are you okay, Ethan?" Maddie asked softly. He slammed the laptop shut as if he'd been caught looking at pornography. "Yeah, fine. Just keeping up with the competition." "She's not your competition, Ethan," Maddie said, her voice laced with a growing insecurity. "She's your ex-wife, and she's marrying Damien Thorne." He snapped the words, erupting with a venom that shocked them both. "Do you have any idea what that means? It's not just that she's successful, it's that the entire world now sees me as the idiot who let her go." "Nobody thinks that," Maddie said, though her voice wavered. Was she trying to convince him or herself? "Oh, they do," he said, his voice dropping to a bitter whisper. "They look at me, and they think, that's the guy who wasn't good enough for Olivia Rossi. And then they look at you and they think..." He trailed off, but the implication hung heavy and ugly in the air between them. "And they think you're the consolation prize." He didn't say it, but Maddie heard it. She saw it in his eyes. Every time he looked at her now, he was comparing her to the ghost of Olivia. Her wholesome, supportive ambitions now seemed small and insignificant in the shadow of Olivia's global success. Her knowledge of nutrition seemed trivial compared to Olivia's knowledge of quantum computing. The very qualities he had praised as wife material were now in his mind evidence of her inferiority. The haunting became a full-blown obsession. Ethan started driving by the old brownstone he and Olivia had once shared, a place they'd sold during the divorce. He would park across the street and just stare at it, lost in a fog of regret. He started trying to piece together the timeline. She had founded Innovate Forward just 3 months after their divorce was finalized. She must have been planning it, working on it during their final year together. The same year, he was complaining that she wasn't paying enough attention to him. He had thought her distraction was a sign of her failing as a wife. He now understood it was the sign of her preparing for a new life, a life that didn't include him. He hadn't just lost her, he had been systematically and surgically removed from her path to greatness. The realization was a slow, agonizing burn, cauterizing his pride and leaving behind a permanent scar. He was no longer the protagonist of his own story. He was a footnote in hers. The digital ghosts were not enough. Ethan's obsession demanded a confrontation in the flesh. He needed to see her, to speak to her, to somehow recalibrate the reality that had spun so violently out of his control. He couldn't just be the man who read about Olivia Rossi in Forbes. He had to force her to acknowledge him, to see him, to give him something. He wasn't even sure what. An explanation. An apology. Validation. He knew that a direct approach was impossible. Calling her would be pathetic. Her number was likely changed anyway. Emailing her would be a digital cry into the void, easily deleted by some high-powered assistant. No, it had to be a chance encounter, something that would allow him to maintain a sliver of dignity. His opportunity came in the form of a high-profile charity gala for the city's children's hospital. He scoured the event's sponsor list online and saw it there in elegant corporate font, Ethelred Industries. Damien Thorne's company was a platinum sponsor. It was almost certain they would be there. Getting tickets was a feat in itself. The gala was one of the most exclusive events of the year. Ethan had to call in a significant favor with his boss, Mr. Henderson, framing it as a crucial networking opportunity. Henderson, likely sensing the desperation, but intrigued by the potential drama, secured 2 tickets. He told Maddie it was a mandatory work event. She was thrilled. She spent a week searching for the perfect dress, finally settling on a soft rose gold sequined gown. She looked beautiful, a shimmering, hopeful figure next to him, in the taxi on the way to the museum where the gala was being held. Ethan, however, felt a cold knot of dread and anticipation in his stomach. He was wearing his best tuxedo, but he felt like a fraud, an imposter about to infiltrate a world where he no longer belonged. The museum's grand hall was breathtaking, transformed into a celestial wonderland of twinkling lights and cascading white florals. The city's elite mingled their diamonds and laughter echoing off the marble floors. Ethan scanned the room, his eyes darting over clusters of politicians, socialites, and business tycoons. And then he saw them. They were standing near the grand staircase, a magnetic center of gravity in the glittering crowd. Damien Thorne was exactly as he appeared in photographs, tall, impeccably dressed, in a custom-tailored suit, exuding an aura of quiet, unshakable power. But again, it was Olivia who commanded Ethan's attention. She was wearing a gown of deep sapphire blue, a clear nod to her engagement ring. The dress was a marvel of minimalist architecture, sleek and severe, yet incredibly feminine. It clung to her form, its sharp lines accentuating the confident way she held herself. Her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, showcasing a pair of diamond earrings that glittered like captive stars. She wasn't just in her element, she was the element. People orbited her, listening with rapt attention as she spoke, her gestures animated and precise. Maddie saw them too. Wow! She breathed, her grip tightening on Ethan's arm. That's her. She's stunning. There was no jealousy in her voice, only pure, unadulterated awe. It made Ethan feel even worse. He steered them towards the bar, his throat suddenly dry. He needed a drink. He needed a plan. He watched her for 20 minutes, a predator stalking his prey. He saw her part from Thorne's side to speak with an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her expression softening with genuine warmth. He saw her laugh at something a city councilman said, a full-throated, joyful sound that he couldn't remember ever hearing from her. This was his moment. She was alone. "I'll be right back," he muttered to Maddie, leaving her by a marble pillar. He walked towards Olivia, his heart hammering against his ribs. Each step felt like wading through wet cement. She had her back to him, finishing her conversation. As the woman in the wheelchair was wheeled away, Ethan stepped forward. "Olivia," she turned. Her eyes, those fiery, intelligent eyes, landed on him. For a fraction of a second, there was a flicker of surprise, a ghost of the woman he once knew. Then it was gone, replaced by a cool, polite neutrality. It was the look one gives a stranger who has mistaken you for someone else. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was calm even. There was no anger, no pain, no shock. There was nothing, and the nothingness was the most painful response of all. "Fancy seeing you here." He managed the words, sounding lame and rehearsed even to his own ears. "It's a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital," she replied, a slight arch in her eyebrow. "I sit on the board. It's not really up to fancy." The implication was clear. "I belong here. What are you doing here?" "Right, of course. That's great," he stammered. "You look, well, the news, I mean. Congratulations. It's incredible." "Thank you," she said. She didn't elaborate. She didn't ask how he was. She simply stood there, a portrait of patience, waiting for him to finish whatever this was, so she could move on. He floundered, searching for the right words. "I guess I was surprised. A tech CEO. Who knew?" He tried for a light, teasing tone, the kind they used to share. It fell completely flat. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "I knew," she said simply. The simplicity of the statement was a blade to his gut. It recontextualized their entire past. He thought he was the one in control, the one setting the terms of their life. He now saw he was merely a bystander to a story she had been writing for herself all along. "All those nights you were on your laptop," he began, a note of accusation creeping into his voice. "You were building all this. You never told me." A flicker of something, not anger, but perhaps pity, crossed her face. "You told me it was a cute little hobby, Ethan. You said real people have to worry about leaky faucets. I learned to stop sharing my dreams with people who would only belittle them." Her words were not a shout, but a quiet, clinical dissection of his failure. He had no response. She was right. From across the room, Damien Thorne had noticed their interaction. He began to walk towards them, not with aggression, but with a calm, purposeful stride. He was a shark gliding through water, effortless and dominant. "Everything all right, darling?" Thorne asked, his voice a low baritone. He slid his arm around Olivia's waist, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. It was not a threatening gaze, but an assessing one. He was sizing Ethan up, and in a single glance, dismissing him as irrelevant. "Perfectly fine," Olivia said, leaning into Thorne's embrace. She turned her smile to him, a smile of genuine affection and partnership. Ethan was just offering his congratulations. "That's civil of you," Thorne said to Ethan, his tone making it clear he thought it was anything but. Ethan felt himself shrink under Thorne's gaze. He was outmatched in every conceivable way, wealth, power, status, and most devastatingly in his role in Olivia's life. He was the past, a footnote. Damien Thorne was the present and the future. Just then, Maddie appeared at his side, looking nervous and out of place. "Ethan, is everything okay?" she asked. Olivia's eyes moved to Maddie. Her expression softened for a moment. She gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of female solidarity that completely excluded Ethan. In that moment, he realized Olivia didn't hate him. He didn't register enough to be hated. He was an obstacle she had overcome, a lesson she had learned. "We should go," Olivia said to Thorne, completely turning her back on Ethan. Dr. Evans wanted to discuss the new pediatric wing. As they walked away, Thorne's hand resting protectively on the small of her back, Ethan was left standing in their wake, the scent of Olivia's expensive perfume lingering in the air. He felt Maddie's hand on his arm, a grounding but unwelcome touch. He had engineered the collision, hoping to cause a dent, a spark, something to prove he still had an effect on her. Instead, he was the one left wrecked on the side of the road, watching her drive off into the stratosphere without a glance in the rearview mirror. The disastrous encounter at the gala sent Ethan into a downward spiral. The cool dismissal from Olivia and the silent, authoritative presence of Damien Thorne played on a loop in his mind. He became sullen, withdrawn, and openly resentful. His relationship with Maddie, already fractured by his obsession, began to crumble under the weight of his misery. She tried to be supportive, but her attempts to comfort him were met with irritation. Her wife-material qualities, her patience, her gentle nature now grated on his nerves, serving only as a reminder of everything Olivia was not. The real twist, the final nail in the coffin of Ethan's self-delusion, didn't come from a headline or a public humiliation. It came from the past, in the form of an old friend and a drunken, pathetic confession. Her name was Clara, a mutual friend from the early days of Ethan and Olivia's marriage. She had been Olivia's confidant and had always maintained a friendly, if more distant relationship with Ethan after the divorce. Maddie, in a desperate attempt to understand the man she was supposed to marry, had reached out to Clara for coffee. She wanted to know what Olivia was really like, hoping to find a flaw, a crack in the perfect facade that would make her feel less like a second-place trophy. They met in a quiet cafe, and Maddie, her voice trembling slightly, explained the situation. "He's obsessed with her, Clara. Since the news about her engagement, he's a different person. He looks at me. He looks at me like I'm not enough. I just need to understand what their marriage was like. Why did they really break up?" Clara sighed, stirring her latte. She had seen Ethan's narrative play out on social media and through the grapevine. She had stayed silent out of loyalty to Olivia, but seeing Maddie's genuine pain changed her mind. Olivia had moved on to an unassailable, new life. Perhaps it was time the truth of the old one was told. "Ethan has his version of the story," Clara began carefully. "The one where Olivia was too ambitious and not domestic enough. That's not a lie exactly. It's just not the truth." She leaned forward, her voice low. About a year before they separated, Olivia wasn't just working on her hobby. She had a real shot. She had a meeting lined up with a venture capital firm, a big one. They were seriously interested in her initial proposal for what would eventually become Innovate Forward. She was terrified and ecstatic. It was all she could talk about for weeks. Maddie listened, her heart sinking. "The meeting was on a Friday," Clara continued, her eyes fixed on Maddie's. "The Thursday night before she and Ethan had a massive fight. He accused her of abandoning their life together, of caring more about nerdy spreadsheets than about him. He told her she was going to fail, that she was delusional for thinking she could compete in that world. It was brutal. The next morning, Olivia went to the meeting, and she bombed. She was rattled, her confidence was shot. The feedback was that her financial projections, the very core of her pitch, were a mess. They were filled with small but critical errors. The VC firm passed, telling her the project lacked financial viability. She was devastated. She thought she had choked under pressure. Clara took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. A few weeks later, Olivia was clearing off their shared computer, and she found the original presentation file in the trash bin. She looked at the file's history. It showed that the night of their big fight, after she had gone to bed, someone had logged in at 2 a.m. and spent 30 minutes in the document, that someone had systematically altered key figures in her financial model. Tiny changes almost impossible to spot unless you knew what you were looking for, but enough to make the whole projection fall apart under scrutiny. Maddie felt the blood drain from her face. "No," she whispered. "There were only two people who had the password to that computer," Clara said softly. "Olivia and Ethan." The truth was a horrific, ugly thing. Ethan hadn't just been an insecure, unsupportive husband who belittled his wife's dreams. He had been a saboteur, fearing her potential success, fearing she would outgrow him. He had actively, maliciously, and secretly crippled her chances. He hadn't just failed to encourage her, he had tried to ensure she would fail. The divorce hadn't been about wanting different things. It was because Olivia had discovered his ultimate betrayal. She never confronted him with the proof she was too broken and too proud. She simply packed her bags and left, deciding that a clean break was better than a war. She would rebuild on her own, far away from the man who had tried to tear her down. That night, Maddie went home in a state of shock. The apartment she had so lovingly decorated felt cold and alien. Ethan was on the couch drinking scotch and morosely scrolling through his phone, no doubt looking for more news about Olivia. The sight of him stewing in his self-pity over the success he had tried to prevent was repulsive. The final vestiges of her love and sympathy for him evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear disgust. She didn't confront him immediately. She waited. Her moment came 2 nights later. Ethan came home late, stumbling and drunk from after-work drinks with colleagues. He was in a maudlin, self-pitying mood, ranting about how unfair the world was. "She has everything," he slurred, slumping into a chair. "Everything. And what do I have?" This was it. Maddie stood before him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stone. "You want to know why she has everything, Ethan?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "It's luck," he muttered. "She met a rich guy." "No," Maddie said, her voice rising with a furious power she didn't know she possessed. "It's because she got away from you. Clara told me, Ethan. She told me about the presentation, about the VC meeting, about what you did to her financial projections at 2 in the morning." Ethan's drunken haze seemed to vanish. He stared at her, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He was caught, utterly and completely caught. He started, but no excuse would come. "You didn't think she was wife material because you were terrified she was made of something more." Maddie continued her words like shards of glass. "You didn't want a partner. You wanted a cheerleader who would stay on the sidelines. The moment she had a chance to get in the game, a game you knew you couldn't play, you didn't just bench her. You tried to break her legs." She held up her left hand and with a final decisive tug, pulled the 1.5-carat cushion-cut diamond ring from her finger. The ring he had called a trophy. It felt cheap and tainted. She threw it on the coffee table where it landed with a dull, unsatisfying clink. "All this time," she said, her voice breaking with the agony of her own foolishness, "I thought I was the woman who was good enough for you. I finally realized the truth. I was just the woman you thought you could control. Your consolation prize. But you lost Ethan. You didn't just lose her, you've lost me too." He didn't protest. He didn't argue. He just sat there, a collapsed ruin of a man stripped of his lies and his last remaining relationship. The ghost of his past betrayal had finally come home, not just to haunt him, but to leave him utterly and completely alone. Maddie's departure was swift and silent. She didn't scream or throw things. The next morning, while Ethan was nursing his hangover, and the even more painful hangover of his exposed soul, she packed her bags. She took the clothes, the yoga mats, the nutrition textbooks. She left behind the life they had built, which she now saw was nothing more than a set piece for his fragile ego. She left the ring on the table. Ethan's world, already tilted, capsized completely. The silence in the apartment was a living entity. It was the silence of two failed relationships, the silence of his own profound moral bankruptcy. He would walk past Maddie's empty closet and feel a pang, not of love, but of loss for the comforting illusion she provided. She had been his shield, his proof that he was a desirable man who had made a good choice. Without her, he was just the guy who sabotaged his brilliant wife and then got dumped by his fiancée. His work suffered. The slick confidence that was his primary professional asset evaporated. His colleagues, who had all seen the news about Olivia and had undoubtedly heard the whispers of his breakup with Maddie, treated him with a mixture of pity and contempt. Mr. Henderson called him into his office one afternoon. "Carter," he said without any preamble, "your numbers are down. You look like hell. Whatever is going on in your personal life, get it sorted. This firm doesn't pay for baggage." The humiliation was absolute. He was failing everywhere. He was the common denominator in his own life's wreckage. He made one last desperate attempt to salvage something. He composed a long, rambling email to Olivia. It was a pathetic cocktail of apology, self-pity, and twisted justification. He admitted to the sabotage, but framed it as a moment of weakness, a desperate act by a man terrified of being left behind. He wrote about how he had never stopped loving her, how he realized now she was the only one for him. He ended it by begging for a chance to talk, to explain himself in person. He hit send in the dead of night, fueled by scotch and desperation. The reply came less than an hour later. It was not from Olivia. It was from an email address he didn't recognize with the subject line, "A final communication." The message was brief and utterly devastating. "Mr. Carter, this email is to confirm that Ms. Rossi has received your message. It is also to inform you that a legal team has been retained to handle any and all future correspondence from you. Any further attempts to contact Ms. Rossi, Mr. Thorne, or their associates, either directly or indirectly, will be met with immediate legal action, including but not limited to a restraining order. Your email has been logged as evidence of harassment. We trust this is the final communication required on this matter. Sincerely, the Office of Damien Thorne." It wasn't even a lawyer's name. It was an anonymous edict from the machine that now protected Olivia. He hadn't just been dismissed. He had been classified as a threat, a nuisance to be managed by underlings. The woman he had once shared a bed with was now so far removed from him that he couldn't even reach her with an apology. He was a piece of spam caught in the filter of her new magnificent life. A few weeks later, the final act of his humiliation played out on every screen in the world. Vogue released the exclusive photos of the wedding. It wasn't a lavish, ostentatious affair, as he might have imagined. It was an event of breathtaking taste and quiet power. The ceremony took place at the Scottish castle he had read about under a canopy of ancient trees. There were only 50 guests. The photos showed Olivia in a wedding dress that defied convention. It was elegant, structured, and modern, with clean lines and a powerful silhouette. She looked less like a princess and more like a queen. But it was the expression on her face that truly broke him. In every photo, she radiated a joy so profound and serene, it seemed to light up the ancient landscape. It was the look of a woman who was not just loved, but seen valued and revered for exactly who she was. The photo that went viral was a candid shot of her and Damien Thorne during the reception. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at each other, laughing, a shared joke or a moment of understanding passing between them. They were a team, partners, competitors on the same side, conquering the world together. Ethan stared at the picture on his phone, sitting alone in the sterile apartment that Maddie had left. He saw everything he had thrown away and everything he had tried to destroy. He had wanted a wife who would make his house a home. Olivia had left and built an empire. He had wanted a woman who would live in his shadow. She had found a man who wasn't afraid of her light, a man who wanted to stand in it with her. He finally understood. Olivia's success wasn't a lucky break or a fairy tale. It was the direct result of her talent, her drive, and most painfully, her liberation from him. He had been the anchor weighing her down. In cutting him loose, she had been free to rise. The wreckage of his life was not an accident. It was a consequence. He was not the victim of circumstance. He was the architect of his own desolation. The wedding photos were not an invitation to his ex-wife's new life. They were the closing credits on his own. A year passed, a year of crushing anonymity for Ethan Carter. He kept his job at the firm, but he was a ghost in the hallways. The swagger was gone, replaced by the quiet, shuffling demeanor of a man perpetually braced for bad news. He was no longer invited to the important meetings or the after-work drinks. He was simply there, a piece of furniture. He sold the apartment he had shared with Maddie at a loss and moved into a smaller, nondescript unit in a less fashionable part of town. His life had contracted, shrinking to the size of his own diminished self-worth. He rarely looked up Olivia anymore. It was too painful. Her star had only continued to ascend. Innovate Forward, with the backing of Thorne's Ethelred Industries, had become a global behemoth. Olivia Rossi was a household name, a regular on most powerful women lists, a symbol of modern female achievement. She and Thorne were the ultimate power couple, their philanthropy as legendary as their business acumen. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Ethan was sitting in a generic coffee shop, nursing a lukewarm coffee and staring out at the rain-streaked street. It was the kind of aimless, empty day that had become the standard for him. The bell above the door chimed, and two women walked in, shaking rain from their umbrellas. One of them was Maddie. He hadn't seen her since the day she left. She looked different. Her hair was cut shorter, in a chic, no-nonsense bob. She wore stylish glasses and carried a leather satchel. The soft, deferential girl he had tried to mold into his perfect wife was gone. In her place was a confident-looking woman. Their eyes met across the small cafe. A flicker of recognition, then surprise. He expected her to turn and leave, or at least to look away with disdain. She didn't. After a moment's hesitation, she walked over to his table. Her friend found a seat near the window. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was steady, devoid of the anger or pain that had defined their last conversation. "Maddie," he responded, his own voice raspy. "You look great." "I am great," she said, and it was a simple statement of fact. "I went back to school, full-time. I'm finishing my master's in public health policy. I want to work with non-profits, help design community wellness programs." "Wow," he said, genuinely surprised. "That's impressive." "It's what I always wanted to do," she explained. "Before I met you, I just sort of, put it on hold. I thought I wanted something else." She looked at him, not with pity, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. "I heard you moved." "Yeah," he said, gesturing vaguely at his drab surroundings. "Downsized." An awkward silence fell between them. It was the silence of a shared history that neither of them was proud of. "For what it's worth," Maddie said, finally breaking the silence. "I hope you're okay." "I'm getting by," he lied. She gave him a small, sad smile. "You know, for a long time I was so angry. At you, but also at myself for believing your whole wife material nonsense. I made myself smaller to fit into the box you wanted for me." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But then I realized something. Olivia wasn't the only one who got away from you. I did too. And in a way, you did me a favor. You showed me exactly what I don't want. I don't want to be wife material. I want to be me." Her words weren't meant to be cruel, but they were the most profound indictment of his life he had ever heard. He had been so focused on his loss of Olivia, this larger-than-life figure, that he had barely registered the true nature of his loss of Maddie. He hadn't just lost a fiancée, he had lost a good person, whom he had actively tried to diminish. I have to go, she said, nodding towards her friend. Take care of yourself, Ethan. He watched her walk away, rejoining her friend with an easy laugh. She picked up her satchel, adjusted her glasses, and walked out of the cafe, back into her new, self-defined life. Ethan was left alone at his table, the coffee cold, the rain still falling outside. He finally understood the full scope of his tragedy. His story wasn't about an ex-wife who became a billionaire's bride. It was about a man who was so afraid of the light in others that he chose to live in the dark. He had been offered 2 chances at love, 2 different but equally valuable women, and he had squandered them both through his own insecurity. He didn't have a wife, a fiancée, or even a narrative anymore. All he had was the quiet, persistent, and undeniable knowledge that he was the architect of his own empty room. And for the first time, he didn't blame Olivia or Maddie or Damien Thorne. He had no one to blame but the man staring back at him in the faint reflection of the rain-soaked window. So what's the real takeaway from Ethan's story? It's a harsh reminder that when you try to define someone else's worth, you often just reveal your own limitations. Ethan thought he wanted wife material, but what he really wanted was a mirror that only reflected the version of himself he liked. He tried to dim Olivia's light, only to be blinded by her eventual brilliance. He underestimated Maddie, only to watch her walk away and build a life of purpose he could only envy. He lost not one, but 2 incredible women, not to fate or bad luck, but to his own suffocating ego. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, or have seen someone get the karmic justice they deserved, hit that like button and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that peel back the curtain on the complexities of human nature. Let us know in the comments, was Ethan a villain or just a tragic product of his own insecurity? We'd love to hear your thoughts.